South Korea's 22nd parliamentary election came to a close on Wednesday, with the country's liberal opposition parties taking the helm of the National Assembly. So what appears to have affected voter sentiment? What are the implications of this election result on the Yoon administration's agenda? And what has been the response from the foreign media? Welcome to Thursday's edition of Issues and Insiders. I'm Min Sun-hee. Today I have our panel of foreign journalists for their take on the results of Korea's latest parliamentary race. For this, I have Jack Barton here in the studio. Jack, it's great to have you back.
It is great to be back.
I also have Andres Sanchez Braun with us. Andres, welcome back.
Thank you for having us here, as always.
Jack, we'll start with you then. Let's begin with your thoughts regarding the result of this latest parliamentary election here in the country. Was the result largely expected, do you think?
I think so. Opinion polls and analysts are often notoriously unreliable, but we had seen for months leading up to this that there was an expectation the Democratic Party would either retain their majority or build upon it, or as one analyst I spoke to just before the election, we're going to have a landslide, a tepid victory or something in between, but we're not going to have the People Power Party come out with a majority. And what we got was that something in between result. So a stronger position than the Democratic Party had before, but not perhaps the landslide they were hoping for. In a sense, of course, this is terrible news for the government. It's going to make it very hard for President Yoon to move forward with his domestic agenda over the remaining 3 years of his single-term presidency. And of course, he's already come out and publicly said that he has heard the verdict and that he will alter policies accordingly. But even if he alters policies, it's going to be hard to move forward with that domestic agenda. If there is any good news for the government, it is that the opposition didn't manage to get the 2/3 majority, or that with the other parties to get that 200 seats, which would have given them a very powerful veto, the ability to change the constitution and the ability to impeach the president. And there's no doubt some people, and I can think of Cho Guk, the head of the Rebuilding Korea Party, who would very much like to have pushed for that. So, whatever relief, perhaps a measure of relief for the government can be gained for that. But yeah, now it leaves South Korea in a position where we have geopolitical risks around the world and in the region. We have economic problems all around the world. And South Korea finds itself in the unenviable position of political paralysis for the next 3 years. But perhaps that's better than the chaos that might have ensued with a more than 2/3 majority.
Right. And Andres, what are some of your takeaways from the result of this latest parliamentary election?
Well, I think that in the end, the coverage that we've been doing, and especially in the last few weeks right before people hit the polls, have basically focused on what more and more analysts were saying and pointing to, that this was going to be some sort of referendum regarding what the Yoon government has done in its first 2 years in power. And but I mean, the main takeaway is that the voters have punished the government, finally, as we've seen. But as Jack has pointed out, this punishment has not been as harsh as some of the latest surveys were pointing out. Some of them were pointing to that 2/3 majority in Parliament. So it could have been much worse. And I totally agree, for the sakes of government stability and national stability, to have a situation where the opposition would have had the ability to circumvent presidential vetoes, but most importantly, the ability to impeach the president. And as Jack pointed out, I'm thinking of parties like the one that Cho Guk leads. Basically, they've run their campaign over the slogan, 3 years is way too long. Basically, their goal was to reach that impeachment. But once again, it's good that Korea is not going to be in such a troublesome situation. But all in all, the message still is that the Korean people seem not to be happy at all with the government. in that regard, it's also good, I think, if we take a little step back and also gain some perspective. Right now, not many, I can't think of mostly any developed economy that has a government that is widely supported by the people. If you know, think about it, think about the US, think about the UK, think about France, think about Japan, or even my own country, Spain. Has governments that are definitely not widely supported and are facing challenges that are pretty similar if you think about it. High inflation, low economic growth, et cetera, et cetera. So at this point, I think this is one thing about globalization in that sense, where governments are, in advanced economies, are facing uphill terms and facing very similar challenges.
All right then, expanding perhaps on what Andres has just said, Jack, what factors, is it just simply the livelihoods perhaps that played a decisive factor in pushing forward voter sentiment based on the result of this latest race?
I think there's a few things here. One of them obviously is the economy. The other thing is perhaps perceptions about Yoon's personality in governance. You know, but I think honestly, the main factor, if I look at it, is if we look at the overall campaign, and we're talking about both parties here, heading into these elections, we can call it negative partisanship. So partisanship being you would normally support your own party or the policies, or we're seeing a mirroring of what's happening in the United States and other countries, in that you almost begin to forget what your own party is doing and you just attack the opposition. It all becomes about attacking the opposition. The one thing we didn't hear anything really of was policy in this. So we can't really say, well, it's about this or that. Actually, the Korean economy compared to other economies is doing pretty well. We heard earlier in the report, the growth figures out. The fact is inflation, yes, we have it, but compared to the United States or Europe, it's been managed really well. Part of that is the Moon Jae-in government's handling of the pandemic, because the inflation is really coming out of that. It's the factories shutting down, money building up. So at the end of the pandemic, you have all this money pouring out, seeking goods that aren't there. But then the Yoon government has also carried on that with the deregulation and the right response coming out the other end. So South Korea, under both administrations, have done very well handling the inflation issue. But people don't really get that bigger picture, and that's because the policies weren't explained. And I heard a lot of people complaining about that afterwards. Okay, we voted this way, but to be honest, this was terrible. This was terrible campaigning. Is this the direction that South Korea is going in now? And it does seem to be, and it seems to be an international phenomena. And I would say the Democratic Party did a better job with their Judgment Day campaigning of sort of demonizing the government than perhaps the ruling party did of demonizing the opposition, because that's what it came down to. And I think that's terrible, because it needs to get back to policy. That's what government should be about. And if it can't be about policy, if it can only be about name-calling and mudslinging, to a degree, democracy is broken, and that's never a good thing at any time.
Right, of course not. Andres, do you suppose that the priority within the minds of the voters was about their party affiliation and not necessarily the policies? Because quite a number of our foreign journalists have been saying that there was not a lot of clarity on the policies being pursued by the two parties. I
could not agree more with Jack. We haven't really heard about policies. Not from the opposition, not from the ruling party. What we've heard is basically parties demonizing each other. And when I've come to ask people, for example, about, Cho Kuk's party has become the third most voted party, even though they only run on the proportional system. But they've taken so much of this so-called punishment vote, which is when I was talking to people who voted for him, they were clearly implying, I don't really like Cho Kuk, but all I want is to punish the government, and he's up for that task. So I totally agree on what you just said. We are forgetting about what policies of the parties that we're supposed to be voting for, and just willing to punish, in this case, the ruling party. I think Of course, some issues like the inflation that has taken a toll on everybody's lives, but then again, that is basically the situation all around the world. Or, for example, the lack of affordable homes, which is an underlying problem in Korea. This government has failed to solve it so far, but so have all these governments that we're talking about. Look at the UK, look at the US, look at Europe, look at Japan, etc. If you pair this with in my opinion, a feeling that people had regarding the government as feeling, let's say, distant, I think they've deemed that the government was not really looking into people's problems. They were distant. They were not connecting with people. And once again, communication has been, I think, pretty deficient in this case. Then there's other issues, and I'm still waiting for figures to see if this happened or not. But for example, once again, we have in Korea a very large pay gap when it comes to in terms of gender. We knew this before, and the last figures have shown that Korea is still the last one among OECD economies where this pay gap between men and women is huge. And we do know that President Yoon had actually promised to dismantle the Ministry of Family and Gender Equality, which he hasn't effectively in the end, but this ministry has been running without a minister since February. I'm assuming that what we're going to see is, for example, many women in their 20s or 30s that have definitely not voted for the ruling party. That's one specific problem I think maybe the ruling party should look into and reflect now.
Right. And even well before the result of this particular election, Jack, quite a number of foreign media covered on the voter sentiment here in Korea, running very deep voter discontentment, that would be. This is something that Andres talked about as well, and mentioned that it's not just here in Korea, but also in the UK, in the US, and neighboring Japan as well. What do you believe is behind this public sentiment, broadly speaking?
We're in a tough time globally at the moment. There's no doubt about it. We've come out the back of the pandemic, and for reasons we were talking about earlier, we have big inflation. Again, compared to the United States, it's not that bad. We talk about onions here in South Korea. That's been a big focus in the local media and in the international media, sort of the price of onions, and perhaps President Yoon's gaffe of going in and saying these are reasonably priced when he was talking about government subsidized onions as opposed to the ones out in the real market, which are 4 or 5 times more expensive. But I think, yes, there are genuine concerns about the economy the way there are everywhere, and perhaps an expectation the government can do more than it can quickly, which is difficult when you have the war in Ukraine pushing up petroleum prices, adding to those issues coming out of the pandemic. We now have sort of conflicts raging in the Middle East, threatening to not just Russian oil, also cutting off oil coming through the Suez Canal, and we have all of these other issues, and everybody's feeling it all around the world. But of course, everyone's looking at their government and going, fix this now. And we can't go back to 1999, unfortunately. That's the reality. But I think also, we've seen a focus on Yoon's style of governance. Whether it's right or wrong, perhaps there hasn't been as good a communication as there could have been. I think recently he gave that speech about why they've pursued the doctors' strategy, and it was a good communication. I think there should have been more of that earlier on, more clear communication with the people, giving a sense of pre-thinking out policy more and explaining the government's position. I think Yoon is finally settling into that role as president and getting a sense of what it is as a president you actually need to deliver. But as we've seen from the National Assembly result, that's come a bit late. And there should have been a bit more of that earlier on. And of course, some of the issues with the First Lady, with the handbag, the designer handbag, there's been a lot of foreign media attention on that, receiving a gift that, yes, she shouldn't have received. But honestly, as an outsider's perspective, if that's one of the worst issues you can come up with an argument to impeach the president, that's a storm in a teacup. There are bigger issues at stake here. So all of that, there's all of that in the mix. But I think it's an unfortunate chapter at the moment, and hopefully there is some soul searching after this, and some tough questions with the government looking, okay, how do we go forward? But also citizens going, we shouldn't put up with all this negative campaigning. We need to get back into policies. We need to get in a positive direction. And the best way to achieve that is to debate and talk about what the country needs to be doing rather than pointing fingers.
Right, needs to be doing in terms of moving forward then, Andres. And that being said, to what extent do you see President Yoon Suk-yeol's domestic agenda being affected by the result of the latest race?
Well, to be honest, the government's domestic agenda was already a little compromised because it never had control of the National Assembly. And right now, this election just is going to make things more difficult. As we pointed out, the ruling party, I think, lost, 9 seats, 9 MPs, whereas the DP earned extra 19. This is going to make things more difficult. We've heard the government already saying that it's going to reflect, that it's going to take the results in a humble way. We've heard the Prime Minister Han Duck-soo offering to resign, taking responsibility for the bad election results, together with 3 presidential aides, including the Chief of Staff. Of course, there's the signaling there, but we need to see what's going to happen in the next few months. Is the government going to keep to try railroading legislation, through administrative orders, or is it going to try and compromise a little more with the opposition? Which in this case, I would personally think it's the better way of doing things right now. Because unfortunately, even though there's no 2/3 majority in this case, it only takes around 10 of your MPs right now to change their minds and try to impeach you. You never know. But for the sake of stability, I think compromise is probably, and positive thinking, as Jack just mentioned, try to actually talk through your own policies and focus less on demonizing your opponent. But as I say, the next months to come will tell us what these 3 years could be. Maybe very long for the sitting government. We'll see about that.
Right. And what about you, Jack? Do you see the result of this race perhaps affecting to a great extent President Yoon Suk-yeol's foreign policy?
I don't think so. The domestic agenda definitely, as Andres just said, will be affected. And I agree totally that it's time for compromise, in order for stability. But I don't think foreign policy will be greatly affected. Obviously, even under the Democratic Party government, there is a close security arrangement with the United States. Perhaps not as close, they would like to see it not as close as President Yoon has pushed that relationship, and they would certainly perhaps like to see more outreach with North Korea and a softer tone with China. But it's nuanced. We're talking about policy nuance. It's the one area there's not too much disagreement. The policy with Japan is something else, and we've seen, even Lee Jae-myung, the opposition leader, going on a hunger strike at one point over the government's policy regarding the Fukushima water release. The government's pushing for much stronger relations with Japan, security-wise, but also rebuilding the economic links, which I think in these difficult times, I personally believe is a good idea. But I don't think, there's not too many ways that you can push back against that foreign policy. So I think in terms of what the government has been trying to achieve, South Korea is a global pivotal state, a stronger alliance with like-minded nations, closer ties again with Japan in terms of security and economy, and the deeper defense relationship with the United States. All of that will continue pretty much as it has for the first part of the term, I imagine.
Right. Right then, Andres, as you mentioned, compromise with the opposition party will be important for the ruling party as well as the government, as well as Jack talking about the need for better communication with the public. All that being said, what else can you tell us about the urgent tasks that need to be tackled by the government? Well,
we were mentioning inflation before. We were mentioning the economy, or to quote the Clinton campaign of '92, right? It's the economy, stupid. But then again, which government in all these countries that we've been talking about has the key to solve any of these issues? I don't know, right? But to think of one urgent task would probably be the doctor strike that you mentioned. And yes, I think that it was a little too late when the government started signaling that they were, willing to compromise at some level with the doctors. But anyhow, I think we all either have some underlying health issues or know people that have them, family, friends, etc., that have been affected by this doctor strike, which has lasted for almost 2 months, right? And of course, this is one thing that needs to be solved right away, tackled right away. And once again, once we see what the votes by gender, etc., age groups look like, maybe tend to the gender gap issue once again. Because I have the feeling that many women of certain age did not like the government's policies in this respect. So one thing to look at, definitely.
Right, then we'll have to wait and see. All right, as always, Andres, thank you so much for your time and your thoughts. And Jack, thank you very much for your insights.
Always a pleasure.
Right, well, that is all the time we have for this edition of Issues and Insiders. Thank you for watching. See you same time tomorrow.